We are super excited to be here today with Dr. Neal Barnard. Now, Dr. Neal Barnard is an adjunct associate professor of medicine at the George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., and he's the president of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, also known as PCRM. Dr. Barnard has led numerous research studies investigating the effects of diet on diabetes, body weight, and chronic pain, including groundbreaking studies of plant-based dietary interventions in patients with type 2 diabetes. Dr. Barnard has authored more than 80 scientific publications and 20 books for scientists as well as the general public. As the president of the Physicians Committee, Dr. Barnard leads programs advocating for preventative medicine, good nutrition, and higher ethical standards in research. He has hosted 4 PBS television programs on nutrition and health, and his research has contributed to the acceptance of plant-based diets in the dietary guidelines for Americans. Thank you very much. Dr. Barnard is one of our heroes and a true leader in the world of plant-based nutrition for human health and for animal rights. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today, Dr. Barnard.
Well, thank you so much for including me.
Absolutely. So, we've heard you talk multiple times about the dangers of dairy consumption for our overall health. And you even published a book outlining the negative physical and psychological effects of eating cheese. Okay, regardless of what the science says, the U.S. continues to produce more cheese and more dairy products than any country in the world. Okay, can you give our audience some insight here into the effects of eating dairy products on metabolic diseases like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, and Alzheimer's disease?
Sure. It's a peculiar thing. We all grew up with the idea that milk is good for strong bones or a great source of calcium or these kinds of things. And yet when we look scientifically at these issues, they get much more complicated than that. It turns out that milk is the biggest source in the diet of saturated fat. That's the fat that raises your cholesterol. Saturated fat is also linked to Alzheimer's disease. And the number one source is actually not meat. The number one source is dairy, especially cheese. There are many other issues about it. But when we do research studies and the people come in, they got diabetes, we put them on a completely vegan diet, meaning no cheese, no animal products at all. They do great. They lose weight. Their diabetes improves. Sometimes it goes away. Even despite these things, I hear so many people say, oh, gee, the one food that I really still crave is cheese. I think, what's that about? I know you've heard this too. Why is it that people crave cheese? It smells like old socks. Why do people want cheese so much? And so I decided to try to figure out what this was about. And we found out several things. Number one, cheese is fattening. It just is. It's very high in calories. Number two, it's addicting. And I don't use that word lightly. I mean physically addicting, not necessarily terribly strongly, but strong enough that people have trouble breaking free. And third, it's linked to all kinds of health problems. And just to make it really, really short and sweet, the health problems relate to the fat. We talked about heart disease. We talked about Alzheimer's disease. The protein that's in cheese, as well as another dairy, but is concentrated in cheese, is linked especially to respiratory issues like asthma or the ear infections little kids will get, or conditions like migraine or rheumatoid arthritis, where there is a sensitivity in the body. Proteins will trigger this, and particularly dairy. And then finally, the milk sugar, which is not so much in cheese, but in other dairy products, lactose is responsible for all kinds of problems, from digestive problems to problems caused when the milk sugar breaks apart into galactose and glucose. And the galactose is associated with infertility, ovarian cancer, and other issues. Now, these are all under further investigation, but we are way past the point where we reached a critical mass of evidence saying, nature had it right when nature started the weaning process. A baby can drink from the baby's mom, but the weaning process protects us from having the risks of having milk after infancy.
Okay, so let's talk about Alzheimer's. I know this is a topic you are very familiar with. You wrote a book, Power Foods for the Brain, and it's a very hot topic right now. A lot of people are referring to it as type 3 diabetes. So can you tell us what does that mean and talk to us about how we can prevent Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's really been an interesting journey, and the journey's not done yet. But if you make a list of all the diseases you don't want to get ever, and you don't want anybody you love to get this disease, at the top of that list is going to be Alzheimer's disease. Because when a person gets Alzheimer's, you lose absolutely everything. Um, and in my own life, I'll never forget my grandpa starting out saying the same stories and jokes again and again, and then he degenerated to the point where he didn't remember things earlier in the day, and then he didn't remember the names of his loved ones, and then pretty soon he didn't remember anything. You don't die; you just lose everything. For many years. But the light at the end of the tunnel came from the Chicago Health and Aging Project, which is a huge study in Chicago, ongoing study, where they rounded up a large group of people and tracked what they ate. And several things came up, but the one that got my attention the most was we were talking earlier about saturated fat. That's the bad fat that's in cheese, also in meat as well. The people in Chicago who had the most bad fat in their diet had 2 to 3 times the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease compared to others. Trans fats, like the partially hydrogenated oils in some snack foods, also associated with risk. And there were some other things that were associated with reduced risk, like vitamin E-rich foods, like seeds or nuts, for example. Exercise, the more that you lace up your sneakers, the better off you're going to be. So there's a lot more to it. But the point that I'm getting at is we're starting to look at Alzheimer's the way we looked at heart disease about 50 years ago, where we're thinking, okay, it's not just old age, it's not just bad luck, and it's not just genetics, it's things I can control, especially diet and exercise. So I am going to guess that if you could get people onto a healthy plant-based diet, none of the animal fats in there at all, get people lacing up their sneakers, I am going to guess that about 80% of cases of Alzheimer's would either be greatly delayed or never occur at all. We need to prove that, but that I think the power of this is somewhere around that magnitude.
Well, I never thought about Alzheimer's disease as being a condition that they said the top of the chronic disease world that you just absolutely want to stave off. But you're absolutely right when you think about it, is that you lose everything completely. You don't have a life at that point.
Right, and you're basically bankrupting your family while you're sitting in a nursing home bed. And it's a great tragedy. I don't know that we can wipe it out completely, but I think we can go a long way toward it. And there's much more to it that we didn't get into just now. Metals play a role, like iron, aluminum, copper. But all of these things are potentially controllable once we know what the issues are. So that's really good news.
Okay, so while we're on the subject of sort of brain health in general, you mentioned earlier that cheese has an addictive nature to it. Can you go into a little bit of detail here about the casomorphins and exactly what they are and how they function inside of your brain and how they can cause a sort of addictive nature?
Yes, this has been really an amazing journey here too. Why would cheese be addicting? And you could say, well, people just like cheese. And part of it is what I call the potato chip effect, meaning anything that's salty and greasy, we get hooked on. So if you have a potato chip, the grease and the salt, we just eat those things. Same with onion rings or French fries. And cheese has that. There's actually more salt, more sodium in a 2-ounce serving of cheese than there is in a 2-ounce serving of potato chips, loaded with salt. And it's 70% fat. So people tend to get hooked for that reason. But there is a drug effect also, and that's the casomorphins that you were mentioning. So if you were to look at casein, 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 the casein protein is the main protein in cow's milk. And in cheese, it's concentrated. As you turn milk into cheese, the water is pushed out and the casein is concentrated. And in your digestive tract, those casein proteins start breaking apart. And if you could look at them under a powerful microscope, it looks like a string of beads. A protein is amino acids all hooked up one after the other, after the other, after the other. And then you digest them, and all those amino acids come apart like beads falling off of a necklace. Except when casein breaks apart into individual amino acids, it leaves some connected, 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 beads still hooked together. These are little peptides called casomorphins, casein-derived, morphine-like compounds. They go into the bloodstream, they reach the brain, and they attach to the very same receptors that heroin or morphine or Demerol or fentanyl or other narcotics attach to in the brain. And they're not as strong as heroin. The strongest one is called morphoceptin. This is a 4 amino acid peptide that comes out of dairy. And when it attaches to the receptors, it has about 1/10 the brain binding power compared to pharmacy grade morphine. So it's significant, it's substantial, but not enough to get you arrested. So it's just enough for a person to say, wow, that cheese, I just like having it around. I hope I have some in my refrigerator. And people think it's all taste and mouthfeel. It's not. It's a drug effect. And the other, by the way, the other reason that we know that there's a narcotic part of it is if you or other people you know ever had serious surgery, and after the operation, you get totally constipated. And what's that about? The reason you're constipated is because they've been giving you Demerol or other narcotic painkillers to knock out your pain, but narcotics also shut down the digestive tract. Well, if a person has overdone it on cheese, what happens is the narcotics in the cheese will shut down their digestive tract too, and they'll complain of constipation. And people who eat a lot of cheese find themselves at the drugstore a lot trying to buy fiber supplements and things like that. It's just a narcotic effect of the cheese, in this case, on their digestion. Wow. So there you have it.
Very interesting. Okay, so since you mentioned casein, can you go into some detail about how casein from cow's milk increases the risk for developing type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, what really got my attention, this was 1992. There was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine where they brought in more than 100 kids. All the kids, the reason they brought them into a study is that they all had been recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. It's about 140 kids. They all were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. They stuck a needle in all the kids' arms. They pulled a blood sample, and they sent it to the laboratory. And what they found was antibodies in their blood. And we've known about this for a long time because antibodies in the blood are little torpedoes that your white blood cells make to destroy a virus or to destroy a bacterium, or in some cases to destroy a cancer cell. The antibodies are little torpedoes designed to get rid of a threat. And it looks like these particular antibodies were capable of destroying their insulin-producing cells, the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas. If you destroy those, you can't make insulin anymore. However, the source of these antibodies, it appeared to be cow's milk. The antibodies were formed to attack a protein in cow's milk, and then by friendly fire, those same proteins, those same antibodies, are able to turn around and attack the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas. Now, this is, that was very compelling because every single child they studied had this. It's what I described as it being cause and effect is a theory. However, there's a substantial amount of evidence in support of this theory, mainly that when kids do not drink cow's milk, if they're breastfed as kids from milk from mom rather than from a cow, their risk of developing type 1 diabetes goes way, way down. So while scientists are continuing to fight about this, I would strongly, strongly, strongly encourage people to not expose their children to dairy products at all. And that means don't give them cow's milk. Don't use a cow's milk-based formula. And this will sound funny, when a woman is pregnant, not drinking cow's milk. Now, I'm saying this to be cautious, but the reason I say that is that we have now learned that cow's milk proteins that a mother consumes, even fairly large proteins, can in some cases go through her digestive tract into her blood. They will get into her breast milk. We learned about this with colic, mother's breastfeeding, and the baby's crying unconsolably. And if the mother takes certain things out of her diet, then the baby stops crying. And that's because these foods are getting into her milk. Caffeine is notorious. Chocolate is also one. But dairy is a huge one. And it's fairly large dairy molecules that get into her milk. So bottom line, I think more research is needed in this area, to tell you the truth. But we have more than enough information to say, let's just not expose kids to cow's milk at all, and let's see if we can prevent this disease.
And there's so many great other alternatives. I mean, there's really just, no reason not to avoid the dairy milk when you have all these other great options.
Oh, well, absolutely. And let's face it, I mean, there are cultures that didn't have dairy at all until recently. Japan, for example. I remember it was the 1980s. There was a film crew that came over to interview me, and we were talking about milk. And I noticed that the interviewer kept wrinkling her nose whenever we talked about milk. And I asked her later, I said, what's that about? And she said, well, she didn't like milk, and milk was not part of their upbringing at all, but they had been pushed to drink it so they could be big like Americans. Japan has suffered with the influx of McDonald's and fast food of all kinds, and dairy was part of it. But diabetes in Japan was much rarer than it has become. So anyway, bottom line, we need more study, but there is no reason to expose our kids to cow's milk. And by the way, they don't necessarily need rice milk or soy milk or almond milk. They can have those to splash on their cereal, but physiologically, the need is actually water.
Excellent. Okay, so one of the things that you have done so much work on at PCRM over the years is fighting the government, like really working on guidelines and helping make progress there. So can you share, are we making progress? What has happened lately, and what can we do to really change this system?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've made huge progress. Things are not where they need to be, but we've made enormous progress. I will never forget when the dietary guidelines for Americans were being revised a number of years ago. You should see this process. That there's a huge auditorium at the USDA, and the committee that's going to decide what Americans should eat and what every school child is going to have. I mean, they're deciding U.S. food policy. The whole committee is sitting on the stage, and there's a microphone in front of them on the floor, and they say, "First witness, please." And somebody comes up, and she will say, "Hello, I'm from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and we're just not getting the iron and protein we need. Remember, beef is your source for that." And she'll speak for 3 minutes, and then she'll sit down. And the next person comes up and says, "Hello, I'm from the National Dairy Council. And remember, Americans aren't getting the calcium they need, and they need milk." And the next person will get up from the Chocolate Manufacturers Association or the Salt Institute or the sugar, I'm not making this up, the fisheries, the alcohol, manufacturers, everybody. And by the end of the afternoon, the committee is just blue in the face. So back in 2000, our attorneys here at the Physicians Committee got a hold of the CVs, the resumes of the members of that committee. And we found that 6 of the 11 members of the committee not only had to hear all these witnesses, 6 of the 11 were paid by industry, especially the dairy industry, but also the egg industry and the meat industry. They were consultants or various things. So we filed suit in federal district court. And the USDA had all their attorneys, and we had one. But it really helps if you're right. So the judge ruled very quickly that the guidelines were produced in violation of federal law. I mean, there are laws about industry influence. And so that was very good. And since that time, they've opened that process up a lot. It's much more transparent than it is. Industry still fights hard, and they're getting more clever all the time. But they're getting better people on those committees. And in 2010, I think it was, they issued 2 full pages about vegetarian and vegan diets. And then this last time, the committee report in 2015 said there are 3 healthy diets that they wanted to highlight: vegetarian, Mediterranean, which is sort of vegetarian light, and third was healthy US, whatever that is. But the point being that they're starting to highlight plant-based diets. And the other piece of good news is that the pyramid, it was maybe an advance on what had been before, but it had a meat group and a dairy group. So in 2009, we went to the federal government and said, get rid of the meat group. Why do you have a meat group? Get rid of the dairy group. And we submitted to the government in 2009 a plate. It had 4 segments, and it was vegetables and fruits and whole grains and beans. And we said, this should be the guidance. Well, we didn't hear back from them. So they didn't respond at all. So in 2011, we sued the government again and said, you have to reply. And amazingly enough, the U.S. government announced they were scrapping the pyramid. And in its place, they were putting a plate. And the plate had 4 quadrants in it. And there were vegetables and fruits and grains. And they didn't say beans or legumes, which is what we wanted. They said protein. And the protein could be chicken or beef, but it could also be beans or tofu. And then they threw a glass of milk on the side. So, like, not perfect. And I'm not taking any credit for that. I mean, maybe it was a total coincidence. But things, the point I'm making is things are getting better. But all this is going to heat up again. This year, the committee is now reforming. And this same process is going to happen. And industry goes there and they fight and they put so much money in it because they want their products to be part of federal policy. So I'm hoping that everybody watching this broadcast will be able to weigh in. You can weigh in, you can comment. And at the Physicians Committee, we'll make sure that on our website we tell you how to do that and when. So yeah, if our voices are heard, I think we can change this.
This is actually super interesting because I didn't obviously know how that process unfolds, but anybody can get up in front of the committee and try and advocate and try and, say, oh, well, Americans aren't getting their calcium, therefore they need more milk. Americans aren't getting their iron, therefore they need more meat. But this is not evidence-based research, as you and I know. So how much evidence actually does factor into the dietary guidelines that the committee eventually decides upon?
Yeah, both of these things happen. One is that people will testify and they will hopefully provide good evidence. But you can also make an impassioned plea. Like a person can go to the hearing and say, I'm a teacher or I'm a principal and I'm really concerned about obesity in schools or something like that. And you can make comments. But there is a lot of evidence as well, and we provide it. And I might also say that industry provides evidence. A lot of industry-funded studies are there to try to push the guidelines committee.
In one of your evidence-based studies, individuals living with type 2 diabetes were randomly assigned into either a low-fat vegan diet or the 2003 American Diabetes Association guidelines. Now, the results showed significantly improved glycemic control and improved lipids in the low-fat vegan group. Can you tell us a little bit, kind of go a little nerdy here, give us a little insight here into the biological mechanisms that actually enable this low-fat vegan group to get better glucose and lipids as a result?
Yeah, it's been an interesting thing. I have to say that we started down this road not knowing why it would work. We've learned since that time why it worked, but it started only because we looked at populations that were following more plant-based diets, and they seemed to do dramatically better. They were thinner, they had less diabetes. And so we started down that road in the 1990s for that reason. But we have since learned what's happening. And I want to say a word of credit to our friends at Yale University, Jerry Schulman and Kit Peterson. When you go to their laboratory, they have these huge magnetic resonance spectroscopy machines. Each one is millions and millions of dollars. And we've been working with them for a while. Our participants, research participants, go up to Yale and they lie down and they go into the machine. And in the machine, what we're looking at is we're looking in their muscle cells. We're also looking in their liver cells. And that might sound strange. What we are looking for is tiny fat droplets within their muscles, fat that they have eaten from a ham sandwich or whatever it might be, gets from their digestive tract through the blood, it parks in the muscles. And once that fat builds up, I'm talking about microscopic particles of fat in the muscles, that stops insulin signaling, or it interferes with insulin signaling. What I mean is, insulin is trying to get glucose from the blood into your muscles, to power your muscles. The insulin parks on the surface of that cell, just like a key in a lock. And if the cell is all full of fat, that key just can't open it. And you can't see that. You can be rail thin. If you've got type 2 diabetes, inside your muscles and inside your liver, the fat buildup is there, even if you don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat. So a vegan diet has a zero animal fat. And you said low-fat vegan diet, that's exactly the word that we use, because you're not taking that bottle of oil and going glug, 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 glug all of your pasta. What I'm trying to do is to get the fat out of your muscles and out of your liver. And as that happens, suddenly the insulin can work again. And this is insulin your own body is making. Suddenly, you're able to respond to it. And that means time is going backwards. When a person develops diabetes, at first, they're totally unaware of this disease process. The fat is building up inside their cells. The insulin attaches and it can't get the sugar inside. So the pancreas makes more insulin and more insulin. Eventually, it'll get the sugar inside. But if it can't keep up, your blood sugar rises. Now, we're going to stop that scenario. Low-fat vegan diet. the fat starts dissipating from the cell. Your body's natural insulin can work better and better. The pancreas settles down. It doesn't have to make so darn much insulin. In fact, I got to tell you, this is a brand new thing. We also discovered just a couple of months ago that the beta cells of the pancreas themselves, the insulin-producing cells, start to do better. They improve their health in the course of doing the same diet. So we're tackling it from both standpoints. But back in 2003, when we started this, we all kind of heard diabetes as a one-way street, and then we started seeing people where they no longer had diabetes anymore. And that was a huge controversy. You remember these days when, you couldn't say to a person, you don't have diabetes anymore. People would get angry. But they just didn't. But anyway, that's the reason. And the reason that's important to mention is a lot of people will say, well, sugar caused by diabetes. Now, I'm not saying that sodas and sugar are health food. I'm not saying that. But the cause of the insulin resistance that triggers it, it's not a soda. It's caused by this buildup of this microscopic fat in the muscles and in the liver. And if my diet does not tackle that, then you're going to have a lot of trouble reversing your diabetes.
Okay, so if it's excess dietary fat that leads to the insulin resistance, what are your recommendations for fat intake?
Let me make it practical first, then I'll give you some numbers. Practically, what I say to our folks here is vegan, so there's no animal products. Don't use added oil. So we teach them how to saute something in vegetable broth or whatever it is. And if they are eating foods that don't have labels, like broccoli or carrots, unlimited. They don't have to worry about that, with a couple of exceptions. I hate to say it, but guacamole and nuts and seeds are pretty fatty. So for a person I'm trying to reverse their diabetes, I'm going to set those aside. And then with a packaged food, like you're getting a frozen pizza, for that, I would look on the label. And if I want to reverse a person's diabetes, I'm pretty strict. I will say 3 grams of fat per serving and keep below that. And that's what we have sort of chosen arbitrarily. And if you add up all the fat in their diet, it's going to end up being about 10% of their energy, 10% of their calorie intake. Your average American now, 30, 35, something like that. And if I get them down to 10, it sounds draconian. But in Japan, before McDonald's invaded, that's where they were, because they were eating lots of rice and vegetables and so forth. So that's what we do. And it becomes super easy, easier than carb counting. And it works.
Okay, so those are really clear recommendations for somebody living with diabetes. And you said, that's what you do specifically to help somebody reverse type 2 diabetes. What about other diseases like hypertension, high cholesterol, Alzheimer's disease? Do you use the same protocol?
Same recommendation, yes. If a person is trying to lose weight, same story. The only question I think is with regard to things like nuts or seeds, because I have to say that if you're having walnuts or almonds, there are traces of omega-3 in there. There's vitamin E in there as well. And so my best guess is that it's probably a good idea to include those in your diet. The reason I'm cautious for a person who's trying to lose weight or a person who has diabetes is I can stop your weight loss tomorrow by giving you free rein with nuts. And people will say that, oh, no, it's they're more satisfying, so you eat less. I have to tell you, that's just not the case. You can easily gain weight from eating nuts or nut butters, much as we all love them. But yes, the vitamin E and the omega-3 in particularly walnuts and almonds, not so much cashews. I have to say they're probably okay. Oh, and by the way, here's the way I encourage people to use them. If you are going to have some nuts, about an ounce a day is good, maybe a good amount. An ounce is you pour the nuts into your palm of your hand. Once it hits your fingers, that is more than an ounce. So stop at that point. And now don't eat it. What you do instead is crumble it up and put it on your cereal or on your pancakes or whatever it is. If you take the nuts and just throw them in your mouth, you know what you do? You will fill your hand again because we can't resist them. So I use them as an ingredient, not as a food group, and I just use them as a flavoring. And that will give you about that ounce a day and that nut feel that you want without the risk of really overdoing it.
Okay, this is actually super cool because in the recent couple of years, this idea of eating a low carbohydrate, plant-based ketogenic diet has become popular, not only for weight loss, but according to some people, to reverse type 2 diabetes and flatline blood glucose in people with type 1. So what would you recommend to somebody living with either type 1 or type 2 diabetes who says, okay, Dr. Barnard, I understand the vegan thing. I totally get it. I'm going to do it, but I'm going to be doing it using a low carbohydrate approach where I'm eating nuts, seeds, olive oil, avocados, you name it.
Well, I think it's fine to test these things in research studies and to continue to do that. But as a recommendation for anybody I actually cared about, I would be very nervous about that for really for this reason, that when we take the carbohydrate, well, first of all, we have to remember what is a natural diet for humanity, and just big picture. We're not blubber eaters, for the most part. We're not eating huge amounts of fat. All the great apes eat enormous amounts of vegetation, particularly fruit, and it's a high carbohydrate diet, either simple sugars in fruit or starchy food. So that's what's natural to us. When we take those things out of the diet, then what we're left with is a huge amount of fat. And don't get me wrong, vegetable fats are much better than animal fats. They really are. If a person tries to do a ketogenic diet with animal fat, in about a third of cases, their cholesterol levels really go up significantly. Sometimes they go up just through the roof. If you're doing a vegan diet that's high in fat and low in carbs, that's less likely to happen, but it's still possible. Now, luckily, when a person does a plant-based diet, they lose weight almost no matter which way they go. And any kind of weight loss is supposed to lower your cholesterol, so that normally does happen. However, with oily foods, let's say it's olive oil, the saturated fat content of olive oil is lower than beef or chicken, but it's not zero. And the numbers are, beef is about 50% saturated fat, chicken about 30%, olive oil about 14%. But if I'm not adding that olive oil, I'm not adding any of that. So it gives me a step ahead. So anyway, there we are. I think for almost everyone who's doing ketogenic diets doesn't understand how to do this in a vegan way. And my good friend David Jenkins has said, well, do an eco-Atkins, meaning 100% vegan. And I think studying it in research, I think, is an interesting thing to do. But I don't think we're at the point of really feeling comfortable about it yet.
Okay, so now that we're talking about some of the logistics of eating and what to do, I know you have some new books that have recently come out. So can you tell us about them and how people can get their hands on them?
Oh, thank you for asking. Yeah, we're always trying to get tools into people's hands. And the newest one, can I show you this? This is the Vegan Starter Kit. And the reason that we did this is we have all kinds of folks who are saying, all right, I want to do this, but I don't want to have to read a whole encyclopedia. Just tell me what to do. So this is the idea that you can read this in 45 minutes and it will answer all your questions: how to eat, what supplements might you need, what should I do when I'm with friends. And it has about 20 some recipes, the real basic recipes to get you started. So for anybody who's thinking, I'd like to know if that works, but I don't necessarily want to dedicate the rest of my life to exploring it, the Vegan Starter Kit I think you'll really like. And then let me mention this newish book. This is Dr. Neal Barnard's cookbook for reversing diabetes. And here I want to tip my hat to Drina Burton, who is a real genius in the kitchen. She did all the recipes. My job is to do the guidelines and the writing of it, but she came up with the recipes and they are super great. All vegan, all low fat. And then one other thing, this actually is the new edition of Dr. Neal Barnard's program for reversing diabetes. This came out originally in 2007, but we felt, all right, it's time to redo it. It's time to update it. And so this book came out. So anyway, have a look. The one that I want to just pitch though, again, this one, the Vegan Starter Kit, the reason that I want to say a word of promoting this book is it's so skinny and cheap that I'm hoping people will buy 20 of them and give away 19 of them to all of their friends who need something like this. And don't just hand it to them. What you have to do, here's my secret. I learned this from my mother. My mom had a high cholesterol level, wouldn't take any of my advice. I would give her books. I'd give her books I had written, and I would go visit her 6 months later. The book would be in exactly the same place on the coffee table. I knew she hadn't read it. Here's the trick. Give somebody a book. Put a Post-it on page 37 and another one on page 89. And then you say, put a little note on the front, say, Mom, I thought of you. A couple places in that book, and I marked them for you. she can't wait. She's going to open it up and she's going to read the entire book 6 times. And then she's going to call you and say, I didn't see myself in there. It's just a trick to make a person read the darn book. So anyway, I hope, these are ways of trying to propagate a helpful message, and I hope people find them as useful tools.
That's brilliant. Actually, word on the street is that the Vegan Starter Kit used to be a much bigger book, but it started eating a plant-based diet, and now it's a lot slimmer. So
that could well be true.
Well, we wanted to thank you so much for your time here today. We know we could talk to you for hours about all the nitty-gritty details here about saturated fat and animal-based protein and casein and beyond and beyond and beyond. But we know we got 1,000 things to do, both for yourself and as well as for us. So we want to thank you for paving the way, for being a leader, and for really being very diligent about spreading the message which you know in your heart to be very true, as well as a message that is validated over and over and over and over again from evidence-based research. So that's a long-winded way of me saying thank you so much for putting in all the effort and for really leading the charge.
Well, let me return that compliment. You have both been inspiring so many people. I'm sure you can't know how many lives you have saved, but it's huge. And I really appreciate the way that you get this word out in a way that's informative and inspiring and engaging. And I look forward to working with you for many years to come. So thank you so much for all you do.